Something extraordinary is unfolding in the Gulf of Mexico right now, and the implications stretch far beyond what most headlines are telling you. Trump has just ordered significant U.S. military movements into these waters, and if you understand the deeper currents of geopolitical power, you'll recognize this isn't just about border security or drug cartels. This is about reshaping the entire architecture of North American relations at a moment when global alliances are fracturing. Think about what's really happening here. As Washington pivots away from its overextended commitments in Europe and the Middle East, we're witnessing a fundamental reorientation of American strategic priorities. Mexico sits at the crossroads of this transition, not just as a neighbor, but as a critical economic partner whose stability directly impacts everything from energy flows to manufacturing supply chains that keep American industry running. The military movements Trump has authorized signal something far more consequential than a show of force. They represent a recalibration of how Washington intends to project power in its own hemisphere, particularly as it faces mounting challenges to its global dominance. The question isn't whether tensions will rise, that's already happening. The question is whether we're prepared to understand what comes next. Let me take you back to understand where we are today, because nothing in geopolitics happens in isolation, and what we're seeing in the Gulf of Mexico right now is the culmination of decades of strategic miscalculations, shifting power dynamics, and a fundamental reorganization of how America sees its place in the world. When Trump announced these military movements, the mainstream media immediately jumped to their usual talking points about border security, immigration crackdowns, and the war on drugs. But that's surface-level analysis that misses the profound transformation taking place beneath our feet. The United States has spent the better part of 2 decades obsessively focused on the Middle East and Central Asia, pouring trillions of dollars into conflicts that ultimately weakened American power rather than strengthened it. We saw the disaster in Iraq, the quagmire in Afghanistan, the destabilization of Libya, and the proxy wars in Syria. All of this happened while something critically important was being neglected: the Western Hemisphere. While Washington was busy trying to reshape the world on the other side of the planet, it took for granted the very foundation of its economic and strategic power, its relationships with Canada and Mexico. These aren't just neighboring countries. They represent integrated economic systems that have become so intertwined with the United States that instability in one creates cascading effects throughout the entire region. Now let's talk about what's actually happening with these military movements, because the official explanations only tell you part of the story. Yes, there are legitimate security concerns along the border. Yes, the cartels have become more powerful and more sophisticated than ever before. But military deployments of this nature aren't just about stopping drug trafficking or illegal immigration. When you move naval assets and potentially other military resources into the Gulf of Mexico, you're making a statement about territorial assertion, about control of maritime routes, about energy security, and about sending a message to other global powers who might be looking to expand their influence in America's backyard. Think about the geography for a moment. The Gulf of Mexico isn't just water separating the United States from Mexico and Central America. It's a critical energy hub where a substantial portion of America's oil and gas infrastructure is located. It's a major shipping corridor through which billions of dollars in trade flows every single day. It's also increasingly becoming a zone where other powers, particularly China, have been making quiet but significant inroads. China's relationship with Mexico has been growing steadily over the past 15 years. Chinese investment in Mexican infrastructure, manufacturing, and ports has created economic dependencies that didn't exist before. And here's where it gets interesting. From Washington's perspective, allowing a strategic competitor to gain economic leverage over your immediate neighbor is a national security problem of the highest order. When we look at Trump's decision to order these military movements, we have to understand it within the context of his broader worldview about American power. Trump has always been skeptical of America's far-flung military commitments. He's questioned why the United States maintains hundreds of military bases around the world, why American troops are still in Germany and Japan nearly 80 years after World War II ended, why the United States is bearing the financial burden of defending countries that are perfectly capable of defending themselves. His perspective, whether you agree with it or not, has been that American power should be concentrated where it actually serves American interests most directly, and nothing is more directly in America's interest than stability and favorable relations in North America. But here's the tension that creates real problems. Mexico is a sovereign nation with its own interests, its own political dynamics, and its own relationship with the United States that has been complicated throughout history. Mexicans haven't forgotten the Mexican-American War, they haven't forgotten how much territory they lost, and they certainly haven't forgotten the countless interventions, both overt and covert, that the United States has conducted in Latin America over the past century. So when American military assets start moving into the Gulf, Mexican political leaders have to respond to domestic pressure. They can't be seen as simply accepting American military dominance without asserting their own sovereignty. This is where tensions naturally rise, not necessarily because either side wants conflict, but because the optics and the politics demand certain postures. Let me connect this to the broader economic picture, because you can't separate military strategy from economic reality. The United States, Mexico, and Canada are bound together through the USMCA trade agreement, which replaced NAFTA. This agreement created one of the largest trading blocs in the world, with deeply integrated supply chains that span all three countries. Your car isn't just American or Mexican or Canadian anymore, it's North American, with parts and labor crossing borders multiple times during the manufacturing process. This integration created efficiencies and lowered costs, but it also created vulnerabilities. When you have supply chains this interconnected, any disruption in one country ripples through the entire system. Now consider what's been happening globally over the past few years. We've seen the breakdown of globalization as we knew it. The COVID pandemic exposed how fragile global supply chains really were. The war in Ukraine disrupted energy markets and food supplies. China's increasing assertiveness has made corporations and governments rethink their dependence on Chinese manufacturing. All of this has led to a concept called friendshoring or nearshoring, where companies want to move their supply chains closer to home, to places that are more politically reliable and geographically proximate. For the United States, that means Mexico becomes absolutely critical. Mexico has been the biggest beneficiary of this nearshoring trend. Manufacturing investment in Mexico has surged as companies move production out of China and into facilities just across the Rio Grande. This has been transformative for the Mexican economy, creating jobs and increasing Mexican leverage in its relationship with the United States. But it's also created a situation where the United States has a profound interest in Mexican stability. If Mexico becomes unstable, if the cartels gain even more power, if Chinese influence continues to grow, or if the political relationship deteriorates, all of those supply chains that American companies have been building become vulnerable. This is why the military movements we're seeing aren't just about traditional security threats. They're about establishing a visible American presence that reinforces to everyone, Mexico, China, the cartels, other Latin American countries, that the United States considers this region to be within its sphere of influence and that it will use military power if necessary to maintain that influence. Now you might find that troubling from a moral or ethical standpoint. You might think it sounds like imperialism or hegemony, and you know what? Those critiques aren't wrong. But we have to be clear-eyed about how great powers actually behave. Every major power throughout history has sought to dominate its immediate region. Russia does it, China does it, regional powers like Iran and Saudi Arabia do it. The United States is no different. What makes this moment particularly significant is the timing. We're living through a period of transition in the global order, the unipolar moment that followed the Cold War, where the United States was the undisputed global hegemon, is clearly over. We're moving into a multipolar world where the United States is still the most powerful country, but no longer has the ability to simply impose its will everywhere simultaneously. This means choices have to be made about where to concentrate power and resources. Trump's calculation appears to be that the Western Hemisphere, and particularly North America, should be the priority. If that means pulling back from Europe, if that means being less engaged in the Middle East, if that means accepting that the United States can't control everything happening in Asia, then so be it, as long as American dominance in its own hemisphere is secured. But here's where it gets complicated, and this is something that doesn't get discussed enough in mainstream analysis. Mexico itself is going through its own transformation. The current Mexican government has been pushing back against some of the neoliberal economic policies that dominated Mexican politics for decades. There's been more emphasis on Mexican sovereignty, more skepticism about American influence, and more willingness to engage with countries like China on Mexico's own terms rather than always deferring to Washington's preferences. This creates a natural friction point. The United States wants a compliant Mexico that aligns with American strategic interests. Mexico wants to be treated as an equal partner, not a subordinate state. When you add military movements into this already tense dynamic, you create opportunities for miscalculation. Neither side may actually want a serious confrontation, But public statements get made, nationalist sentiments get inflamed on both sides of the border, and suddenly you're in a situation where backing down becomes politically costly for leaders in both countries. This is how tensions escalate even when the underlying interests might actually be compatible if managed carefully through diplomacy rather than military posturing. Let's also talk about what this means for ordinary people, because geopolitical chess games aren't just abstract exercises. They have real consequences for real lives. If tensions between the United States and Mexico continue to rise, we could see disruptions in trade that increase prices for American consumers. We could see investment flows change in ways that cost jobs on both sides of the border. We could see migration patterns shift as Mexicans become more uncertain about their economic future. And in the worst-case scenario, we could see actual military incidents even if neither side wants a war, simply because when you have military forces operating in close proximity under tense conditions, accidents can happen. The broader lesson here is that we're entering a period where geography matters again in ways it hasn't for decades. During the height of globalization, people talked about the world being flat, about distance being irrelevant, about capital and goods and people flowing freely across borders. That world is dying if it isn't already dead. What's replacing it is a world where proximity matters, where secure supply chains matter, where having friendly relations with your neighbors matters more than having abstract commitments to global institutions. The United States is relearning these lessons, sometimes painfully. I want you to think about the energy dimension of all this as well, because it's crucial and often overlooked. The Gulf of Mexico is home to significant oil and gas production facilities. American energy independence, which has been a major strategic goal for decades, depends in part on the security of these facilities. But it's not just about American production. Mexico is also a major oil producer, and energy cooperation between the United States and Mexico has been a cornerstone of the relationship. If that cooperation breaks down, if Mexican energy policy moves in directions that Washington finds threatening, or if other powers gain influence over Mexican energy decisions, that becomes a strategic vulnerability that the United States will feel compelled to address. There's also the question of what message these military movements send to the rest of Latin America. For years, the United States has been losing influence in Central and South America. Countries like Brazil, Argentina, and Chile have been charting more independent courses. Chinese investment throughout the region has been substantial. Russian engagement has increased. If the United States is seen as successfully reasserting its dominance in Mexico through military pressure, other Latin American countries will take notice and adjust their calculations accordingly. Conversely, if Mexico successfully resists American pressure and maintains its sovereignty while deepening relationships with other powers, that also sends a message, one that could accelerate the decline of American influence throughout the hemisphere. What we're witnessing is nothing less than a test of whether the United States can adapt to a changing world while maintaining its position as the dominant power in the Western Hemisphere. The old playbook of simply dictating terms to Latin American countries doesn't work anymore. These countries have options now in ways they didn't during the Cold War or the immediate post-Cold War period. But the United States also has significant leverage, economic, military, and geographic. How these competing pressures resolve will shape the future of the entire region for decades to come. The military movements in the Gulf of Mexico are a symptom of these deeper tensions. They're a signal that Washington is prepared to use hard power to back up its interests in the region. Whether that's wise, whether it will be effective, whether it might backfire by pushing Mexico and other countries further away from the United States, these are open questions. What's not in question is that we're in a period of significant geopolitical flux, and the old certainties about American power and the nature of international relations in the Western Hemisphere no longer hold. As you watch this situation develop, pay attention not just to the immediate headlines about military deployments or border tensions, but to the underlying strategic logic driving these decisions. Understand that both the United States and Mexico are responding to incentives and pressures that are bigger than any individual leader or party. The structural forces pushing toward either confrontation or accommodation will persist regardless of who's in office in Washington or Mexico City. And recognize that what happens between the United States and Mexico will have profound implications not just for North America, but for the entire global system as it transitions into whatever comes next. This is the real story unfolding in the Gulf of Mexico right now, and it's one that deserves far more serious attention than it's getting from most media outlets.